Hey everyone, welcome to Mountainside Tabletop. Just me today. Brad and I recently split on the latest Kill Team box put out by Games Workshop. He took the Blooded Kill Team, and I got the Phobos Marines. We're both going to film our process for creating the custom schemes that we've got for our respective sides. For the Marines, I've decided to do a custom chapter based on the Mountainside Tabletop logo. I'm going to do my best to match the colors as close as I can, as well as attempting some custom chapter markings made of our logo. Of course, there will be some battle reports coming with all of the models and terrain that came in this kit, as well as Brad's video of how he came up with his pretty wild blooded scheme. So, settle in, grab a coffee, and hang out while I make it through all of this gray plastic. Here's a list of all of the different paints that I'm going to use throughout this project. I'd also just like to say, I don't really have any delusions about the level of painter I am, and I know that there's a lot of people on YouTube that do some really incredible things. This is just my process, and while it might not work for everyone, it does work for me, so I hope you learn something from it and I hope you enjoy. Well, the first step after all the building and scraping of mold lines is to do a quick zenithal prime, just using rattle can primers. Even though I'm going to be using pretty opaque paints eventually, and this will all be mostly covered up, I still find it's a pretty important step and just helps me see where the light's going to hit and areas to highlight, and just helps me make sense of what I'm looking at. Throughout this process, I'll mostly be focusing on the painting of this saboteur unit. He's got a good mix of leather, some dangly pouches, a standard gun, some metal here and there, and a pretty classic Space Marine helmet. And most importantly, he's got this wide open pose, and so I'll be able to paint him without really struggling and showing you just how terrible I really am at this. Well, unfortunately, the first step is always base coating, and on Space Marines, we all know how terrible that is. For the dark blue, we're using a 50-50 mix of Vallejo Imperial Blue and some cheapo Dollarama black paint that I've had for 100 years. At this point, it's really important that the paints are super thin. I've still got about 75,000 coats to put on this thing, and so you really don't want to start clogging up details now. And also, you want to leverage that zenithal prime for as long as you can. Next step is base coating all the black with the same Dollarama cheapo paint, focusing mostly on their torso, the few exposed areas in their legs, and of course the bolter casing. Alright, for the darker green in our logo, we're using Sybarite, Sybarite green. I've decided to do the right knee of each of these Marines in this color. Next, I do about a 60-40 mix of that same green with some Dollarama white paint, and do their big left shoulder pad. Alright, now I'm going to break out my all-time favorite paint, which is Iron Warriors by Citadel. It's like a nice dark metallic that I find gets much better coverage than Leadbelcher. And just start picking out all the little metallic areas. The skull on their chest, the rest of the bolter, their little goofy antennas, the ubiquitous Space Marine backpack vents, and you know the drill. And now we have the least pleasant part of every Space Marine project, which is lining this outer trim piece on the big left-hand shoulder pad. Obviously, the key here is just to really take your time, keep the paints thin enough that when you inevitably make a mistake, it's not too big a deal to cover up, and just be willing to go back and forth and spend your day dealing with this. After enduring that torture, you now get the payoff of being able to do a nice Nuln Oil bath over all of the areas you've painted so far. I put it on pretty thick here because I spend a lot of time kind of bringing the colors back up, and I'd rather establish that shadow really strongly now. When it gets to the left shoulder pad, I just kind of try to line the area that I already did so I don't need to spend too many coats building up that light minty green again. Now we move on to what I think is the most satisfying and enjoyable step in this whole process. If you've been saving a nice brush from base coating, now's the time to break it out. Just start building up those base coat layers again, just in the areas that you want to emphasize. You can keep the paints thin and really just place the paint wherever you want here. I always find painting this weird butt flap armor on Marines super satisfying, so take your time and enjoy that. Take some extra time on the chest to make sure you've got a nice, clean blue coat there. Here you can see a model on the left that's had this treatment done versus the one on the right. You can see why this is such a satisfying step. This takes a huge leap out of the ugly phase and starts to immediately look much more presentable. Alright, so next I'm doing kind of the same thing with the knee pad, the shoulder pad, and then that awful trim on the side. I guess my concentration slipped when I got to the top of the shoulder. Disaster struck. Obviously that was pretty frustrating, and it was during a particularly boring episode of The Office, as you can hear, so just a few more hundreds of layers of going back and forth to establish that line again. So after getting that firmly into the good enough phase, I took my narrow long brush and lined the side of the trim with Nuln Oil to create a bit more separation. I then mixed a tiny more white into that green mixture, really watered it down quite a lot, and then started putting the first highlights just on the top facing round part of the shoulder pad. Next I started base coating all of the leather with Mournfang Brown. Make sure you get all of the little dangly pouches and embarrassing garter belts. These guys have a lot on them. No big surprises here. I break out Old Faithful Agrax Earthshade and shade all of the brown leather parts. I then mixed up a skin tone, going back and forth with some brown, white, and red paints, just to try to get something kind of in the middle of the range that I could then manipulate lighter or darker later, and applied a couple of thin coats to all of the exposed heads. Followed, of course, by some more Agrax Earthshade. So as you've probably gathered by now, my process for painting minis is pretty non-linear, and I tend to just kind of follow my intuition and see where it takes me. So although I definitely could have been working on highlighting now and getting some more detail going on the armor and faces, I decided this was a good time to work on the custom transfers. So the first thing I did was take the transfer sheet that comes with the kit and measure out a few of the shoulder transfers. These ultramarine transfers take up a huge part of the shoulder pad, and I'm not expecting ours to fit quite so well, but I use it as a rough guide. Then I went in Photoshop, took a transparent version of our logo, and put it a bunch of different sizes in this one PDF document, hoping that one of them would work. I then printed it out on this waterslide transfer paper and applied 3 coats of this clear acrylic varnish. I'm not sure if this is the right one or the best one to use. This is my first time doing this, and it was all a bit of an experiment. Spoiler alert, it worked, and I think I can officially recommend it. While I waited for the varnish to dry on the waterslide transfers, I started to build up a highlight layer on some of the blue areas. For this highlight layer, I just used the pure Imperial Blue without any of the black in it. Then I continually add more and more Caledor Sky blue to the mixture to brighten it up and highlight smaller and smaller places on the top facing areas of the model. Eventually working up to just a few selective edge highlights with Caledor Sky Blue. Now I do a quick base coat of the eye lenses with Wordbearer's Red. Next, I add a little bit of yellow to that mixture, really water it down, and just do a small layer on the inside part of the eyes. And then finally, once that's dry, do some deep breathing exercise and do a couple tiny white dots just on the edge of the eye lenses. Now I think at this point I'm just procrastinating doing the decals because they really frighten me, but I'm just going to base coat these chest grenades with a kind of drab military green. Now I mix some tan paint into that Mournfang Brown and do a light dry brush on all of the leather areas. I finally worked up the courage to try the waterslide transfers. After doing a couple tests, I realized that unlike the Games Workshop transfers, the transparent backing isn't limited just to the image itself, but is over the whole thing. So I had no choice but to cut these much closer than I usually would have, and make the whole process much more finicky. I then let it soak for about a minute in a bit of water, and then apply it using a couple brushes. I keep the area wet and move it around and press it around to get it where I want it and smooth out as many of the wrinkles as I can. At the end of the day, I'm pretty happy with how they turned out, even though the process was much more difficult than the usual transfers are. Now back to highlighting. I mix up a dark gray and start picking out some of the top facing edges of the black areas, like on the torso, the bolter, and the back of the legs. After that, I add some white into the original Imperial Blue, really water it down, get my brush to a nice fine point and start doing some scratches all over the blue armor. Then for another weathering step, I sponge on some Iron Warriors all over the metal parts. Here I'm trying to imagine the areas that are most likely to come into contact with abrasive surfaces or receive bullet wounds and that sort of thing. Next I 3D printed some bases. I took a design made by Don Eldaro on Thingiverse and just scaled it down to 32mm and added the tapered edge typical of Warhammer bases. I've linked the original STL file in the description. As always, with 3D printing comes layer lines, so I had to do a quick sand on all of the base rims to make it less obvious and make it so that Brad would be able to sleep at night. So I'm not crazy about the little plastic rocks that are sculpted onto the feet of some of the models, so I've trimmed them off and have added these little zip ties so I can keep the standing geometry the same. Then I filled the gaps created by the zip ties with the classic super glue and baking soda mixture. Once that was dry, I added some Typhus Corrosion all over the bases, watered down a little bit to kind of mask the 3D printer texture as well as give something for a dry brush to hold on to. Then I just dry brushed the hell out of all of them, going back and forth between a few different silvers, some orange rust colors, and some brown washes and that sort of thing, just to kind of build texture and make it look right. Now that they're all based up and their armor is more or less at the same stage and complete, I can start working on all the little individual unique things that they have. The veteran has these 2 purity seals. I base coat all the parchment with this khaki paint and the big metal seal with a bronze color. I then give everything an Agrax bath. For the smoke grenade, I first base coat everything with a light gray, and then I do a bit of a wet blend from a darker gray all the way up to a pure yellow. Once that's dry, I shade the underside and all the recesses with Nuln Oil to make that smoke look even more disgusting and toxic. So I don't really understand this, but this kit comes with 2 units that are supposed to drop mine tokens on the battlefield, yet only 1 mine to do that with. So I had to create another one out of some cocktail skewers and a leftover piece of the Voxbreaker that I wasn't using for the second mine. Once those were primed and ready to go, I just gave them a quick paint, a quick shade, and then did some extra details on them at the end. Next, I added some scratches to the green and turquoisey parts of this, doing the same method as before, just substitute the green obviously instead of the blue. I then decided to tackle the hair and faces of the 2 units. For the sergeant, I mixed up a kind of dark salt and pepper gray, and then for the veteran, I decided to do a kind of desaturated chestnut situation, though as I was painting it, for some reason it just struck me that this guy reminded me a lot of Andy from The Office. I gave them both a brown wash, which served to kind of contextualize the sergeant's gray a little bit, and it also toned down veteran Andy's chestnut a touch. While waiting for all that to dry, I decided to just throw on a few more details onto the bomb and then put a little purple wash in the screen, just to cover up how poorly I did them. Once the washes were dry, I kind of bring back the colors on the raised areas of the purity seals with the original tan paint. Gotta say, one thing I really like about this squad is how few of these stupid state fair participation ribbons are on these Marines. Next I do a pass of all the red, so that's the handles on the knives, the wax on the purity seal, a couple grenades, and then the big lenses on the incursor rifles and backpacks. I decided to paint a few of the lenses green just for some extra contrast. Looks a little bit like Christmas now that I'm seeing it, but you know, you live with the decisions you make. Finally, I get to the always nerve-wracking part that everyone hates, which is doing some highlights on the face. I don't go too far with this, and I keep my paints really thinned down. They look pretty stark right now and like I'm painting raccoon masks on them, but trust me, with thin enough paints, it dries pretty transparent and it doesn't look quite like this. You know you can see the light at the end of the tunnel once you start doing the black rim on the bases. And now the last detail that I realized I kept missing was just to do the little brass handle guard on all the knives. Well, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Before we do the grand reveal, just want to remind you, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment, leave us a like. It really helps us a lot and we love to read all of them. I don't know a ton about Space Marine Successor chapter lore, so if you've got a good idea for a name for this chapter or maybe some background lore, let us know in the comments. We'll pick our favorite one and incorporate it into the narrative of our next battle report. Make sure you have your notifications turned on so you can stay tuned for Brad's painting video, as well as the few battle reports we've got cooking up right now. Without any further delay, here's the glamour shots of the mountainside tabletop Phobos Strike Force Marines.